For 300 years, humanity was a myth. Not a rumor. Not a half-forgotten legend whispered at the edges of star charts. A myth, categorized, filed, and dismissed by the Galactic Council with the same bureaucratic finality reserved for ghost stories told by cargo haulers who'd spent too long in deep space. The human anomaly, as the Council's Xenorchives called it, was a collection of contradictory sensor logs, garbled distress signals, and one infamous incident 3 centuries prior in which an entire Crothy border fleet had vanished near a yellow dwarf star designated Sol 3. No wreckage. No survivors. No explanation. The Council had concluded, after 40 years of fruitless investigation, that the fleet had suffered a catastrophic reactor cascade. Humanity, the supposed inhabitants of that yellow system, was deemed a statistical artifact, a story that had calcified into pseudo-history. High Chancellor Zyrex, who had risen through the Council's ranks on a platform of rational governance and measured diplomacy, found the whole affair faintly embarrassing. He'd built his career on excising superstition from galactic policy. The humans were the Council's last ghost story, and he intended to bury it for good. Which was why, when the diplomatic envoy ship Lucid Accord dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system and immediately stopped transmitting, Zyrex assumed equipment failure. He was wrong. 3 days later, a single vessel entered Council space. It did not request docking clearance. It did not broadcast diplomatic credentials. It simply arrived, decelerating from a velocity that should have torn it apart, and settled into orbit above the Council's capital world with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once considered the possibility of being stopped. Sensor analysts aboard the orbital defense grid scrambled to classify it. The hull geometry matched nothing in the Council's Xenotech archive. The drive signature defied 3 known propulsion theories. And painted along its flank, in stark human lettering that translation algorithms rendered with unsettling literalness, was a single name. ISS Tempest's Reckoning. High Chancellor Zyrex received the report in his chambers with the patient skepticism of a man who had spent his career disbelieving exactly this sort of thing. A myth, he said, does not have a whole number. It has several, Chancellor, his aide replied. And it has weapons signatures our scanners can't fully resolve. And it has opened a channel. It's asking to speak with you. By name. Zyrex's skepticism did not so much crack as quietly, professionally, relocate itself. Admiral Darian Voss had not wanted this assignment. He'd wanted, frankly, to never speak to the Galactic Council at all. 300 years of cautious isolation had served humanity well. Humanity had watched the Council's wars, its purges, its slow-grinding conquest of 100 lesser species, and had concluded, collectively and without much debate, that the galaxy at large was not yet ready to know they existed. Not until they understood what they were dealing with. Not until first contact could happen on humanity's terms, not the Council's. But the Lucid Accord had wandered into the Sol system's outer defense perimeter, triggered the automated response protocols, and gotten itself very thoroughly disabled, its crew alive, shaken, and now extremely aware that the uninhabited system they'd entered was nothing of the sort. The genie, as humans like to say, was out of the bottle. Someone had to go explain the rules of the new game. Voss had drawn the short straw. Or, more accurately, he'd been the only flag officer in the fleet who could be trusted not to enjoy this too much. He materialized, not literally, the Council's hollow projection technology did the work, at the center of the High Chancellor's Council chamber wearing his dress uniform, hands clasped behind his back, expression carved from the same patient stone his ancestors had used to wait out ice ages. High Chancellor Zyrex, Voss said. I understand there's been some confusion about whether my species exists. The chamber, packed with 24 counselors from species that had built empires before humans had built fire, went very quiet. Zyrex recovered his composure faster than most of his colleagues. It was, Voss would later admit, almost impressive. Admiral. I extend the Council's apologies for the Lucid Accord's unauthorized entry into your territory. We were unaware your system was inhabited. You were unaware our species existed at all, Voss said. I've read the file. Human anomaly. Statistical artifact. I particularly enjoyed the appendix where your Xenorchive committee voted, 11-3, that we were a misidentified Crothy religious cult. A counselor near the back made a small, strangled sound. The Crothy fleet you lost 300 years ago, Voss continued, crossed into soul space without invitation, ignored 17 separate warning broadcasts, and opened fire on what they believed was an unmanned listening post. It was not unmanned. We responded. I won't pretend that engagement was clean, it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be a message. Apparently the message got lost somewhere between "don't do that again" and "they were never real to begin with." Xyrex's mouth had gone dry. He was aware, distantly, that every counselor in the chamber was watching him, waiting for the man who'd spent his career dismantling myths to figure out what to do with one standing in front of him, fully armed, entirely real. What, Xyrex managed, do you want, Admiral? It was, Voss thought, the right question. Possibly the only question that mattered. I want you to update the file, Voss said. Humanity is not a myth, not an anomaly, and not a religious cult. We are a species of approximately 40 billion, spread across 11 systems, with a defense doctrine your council would find educational and a strong preference for being left alone unless we choose otherwise. We did not announce ourselves for 3 centuries because we were watching how you treat the species you do know about. The Valkyrie border annexation. The Ashtani resource quotas. The Drevith peace accords your fleet violated twice. Voss let that settle. We were not impressed. The silence in the chamber had a texture to it now, thick and uneasy. You're telling us, Xyrex said slowly, that you've been observing the council. For 300 years. Unseen. I'm telling you we built our entire foreign policy around it, Voss said. Humanity doctrine, we call it, when we're being formal. Less formal version, don't trust an institution by its press releases, trust it by what it does when it thinks no one human is watching. Today, you found out someone was. Xyrex sat, not collapsed, not defeated, but with the deliberate slowness of a man recalculating every assumption he'd built his career on. And now? Now that we know? Now you have a choice, Voss said, and for the first time something other than stone moved behind his eyes, not warmth exactly, but the suggestion that warmth was possible, conditionally, contractually. You can treat this like every other first contact in your council's history, assess our resources, calculate our military value, decide whether we're worth annexing, allying with, or eliminating. I'd advise against the third option specifically. Or. Xyrex asked, and meant it. Or you can ask us what we actually want, listen to the answer, and find out that a species which spent 300 years quietly making sure it never had to fight a war it didn't choose might be a useful neighbor to have. We're not interested in your seat at this council, Chancellor. We're not interested in your resource quotas or your annexation treaties. We're interested in being left to our own systems, trading on our own terms, and not being shot at by fleets who assumed we were a ghost story. Xyrex studied the hologram in front of him for a long moment, studied the patience in it, the certainty, the complete absence of the desperate posturing he'd come to expect from new species making first contact with a council 100 times their size. Voss wasn't posturing. He didn't need to. That, more than the unscannable hull or the unresolved weapons signature, was what finally, thoroughly convinced the High Chancellor that the myth standing before him was not a myth at all. The file will be updated, Xyrex said quietly. Today. Good, Voss said. I'll also want the Lucid Accords crew released. They're fine, just embarrassed, and frankly so are we about the whole thing. And Chancellor, for what it's worth, I don't think you're like the rest of your predecessors. The fact that you're still listening instead of reaching for a panic button tells me that. Xyrex allowed himself, for the first time since the briefing began, something almost like a smile. High praise, Admiral, from from a species that didn't believe my council deserved to know it existed. Don't get used to it, Voss said, and the hologram began to fade. Earn the rest. The transmission cut. The chamber remained silent for a long moment afterward, 24 counselors from species that had ruled the stars for millennia, sitting with the quiet, vertiginous understanding that somewhere in a quiet yellow system, humanity had been watching them the entire time, taking notes, and waiting to see if it was worth saying hello. The galaxy, it turned out, had been wrong about a great many things. Humanity was simply the first myth it had ever been forced to apologize to.